A while ago, I came across this tweet that outlines the bare minimum for holding a conversation. It lists a whole bunch of classic authors as the basic prerequisites for simply having a discussion. And it's been brewing in the back of my mind for months, because I really don't like the way we talk about books now, and I want to explore why. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Literary Ragebait. Over the past year, I've come across a series of articles and posts and videos that I can only describe as literary ragebait, and a few of them went really viral, as ragebait tends to do. Firstly, there was an article by Dazed magazine called 10 Books That Are Dating Red Flags. On it, they listed Blood Meridian, American Psycho, as well as Bell Hooks' All About Love, quote, anything by Dostoevsky, and really bizarrely, the children's book series Percy Jackson, as dating red flags. This list was already covered in quite a lot of detail by the YouTuber Man Carrying Things, so I won't go into too much about it here. But there was something that rubbed me up the wrong way about that article, and it took me a while to realize exactly what that was. After that, I started to get recommended all sorts of YouTube videos on whether BookTok was killing reading. I was at the time pretty unfamiliar with BookTok, but it's essentially kind of light filler novels that are sometimes erotic in flavour. And that too got me thinking about the attitude we take towards reading. Then, in the background to all of this, there's the fact that reading itself is visibly in decline. We talked about this a lot in my discussion with Jared Henderson. Fewer and fewer adults are reading for pleasure, and there is a real danger that the popularity of the practice of reading will just never recover from this as more enticing and attention-grabbing technologies take its place. This often sparks its own kind of debate, with one side mourning the death of reading and another side sort of either celebrating it or saying that it doesn't matter much either way. And as I was reading and watching and generally encountering all of this, there was a particular character that I kept seeing crop up everywhere, and I'll call them the Reader for the sake of having a label. The Reader isn't any specific person. I'm not, as they say, vague posting. It's instead a kind of stock character, an internet archetype, if you will. You'll see this Reader pop up in certain comment sections, even my own. They'll normally say something about how people these days are too stupid to read real literature, or to understand the nuances of great classics. For the Reader, reading isn't an activity, it's something like a moral badge of honor, an intellectual status symbol, or a tool with which they can condescend to others. They're that person who will lambast you for not having read this or that, and if asked, they will happily list off all the books that they have read, whether or not they have, in fact, read them, and they'll treat this list as if it is a reflection of them as a person. They're an absolute pedant when it comes to their favourite books, and they have no time for anything that is not to their taste. If they're a fan of French literature, then German or English literature must be complete swill by comparison. If they're a more widely defined fan of the classics, then this must go with the thought that anything written in the past 100 years or so is total rubbish and never worth reading. This is the person who actually makes you want to talk about books far less, since they have very little patience for innocent curiosity or the sheer willingness to learn more. For them, a kind of endless literary rote knowledge is the only currency that matters, and their fondest wish is to turn into the human Encyclopedia Britannica for all matters literature. In itself, this wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, if it weren't for their insistence that this made them better than anyone else, and their, let's say, lack of restraint in expressing this idea. Now, I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit, but you'll all know the kind of person that I mean. They're quite intimidating to encounter for someone who just wants to get started with classic literature, because they all seem to insist that if you don't like the same books that they like, or even share their interpretations of those books, you are irredeemably thick. We'll come back to some of those themes later in the video. But this channel is all about honing your analytic skills, and that's why you should check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that studying STEM subjects like maths or science or programming can be really difficult. These subjects can get rather unintuitive rather quickly, and that often presents real challenges for students. But this is where Brilliant can be really helpful. Brilliant has added a large number of topics this year, so you can learn anything from programming with functions to probability theory to discovering the ins and outs of how large language models work or trying your hand at classical mechanics. Additionally, Brilliant's learning is all based around completing various activities, so you can learn by putting what you're learning into practice, and this both just improves retention and stops things getting dull. Brilliant also personalizes your learning, which helps you improve at a steady and reliable pace. If you want to improve your own analytical skills, then you should check out the logic courses on Brilliant, which will just let you see what logic is all about. And with even a little bit of logic, the world is a whole lot clearer. To learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. Brilliant's also giving my viewers 20% off their annual premium subscription, so please do check that out. But anyway, back to the video. At first glance, it seems like the reader and the authors of articles like 10 books that are dating red flags might have very little in common. For a start, I think the writers of that article would probably hate to be compared with literary elitists. But I ultimately think that these two people are cut from the same cloth. What they share, in my view, is a particular way of viewing reading, and that's what we'll be exploring for the rest of the video. Firstly, for both of these camps, the activity of reading is much less important than what reading says about someone as a person. In effect, they both treat reading as primarily a means to judge themselves and others. To speculate a little, I think this might actually be linked to the decline in reading as a whole. As reading becomes a niche way to spend your time, it becomes easier to use it as a way to distinguish an in-group from an out-group. Sometimes this is done with the mere activity of reading. Sometimes it's done by people who insist you must only read the classics. Sometimes it's really quite bizarrely specific, and it's based around particular books. For instance, one of my personal quests recently has been trying to read Lacan, and try really is the word here. He's a quite tricky read. And I found people who say that anyone who hasn't read Lacan or doesn't interpret him in the same way that they do is an ignoramus. Now, I'm just a beginner to Lacan, so in my case, they're probably right. But this attempt to create a sense of intellectual superiority and use reading to demean the intellect of others is a constant among all of these groups. I think the reason why I personally find the character of the reader so very irritating is because quite often they love many of the same things that I love, but with an attitude that I think creates an unnecessary air of mystique and hostility around, oftentimes, the classics. If I were to meet one of these people at a party and we were both in relatively genial moods and they weren't feeling too judgmental, I expect that we'd probably get along like a house on fire. But at its core, the primarily judge-based attitude put forward by the reader isn't one that encourages other people to partake in the activity that they love, but instead, its effect is to exile those who have not already read all that they have read to wearing a kind of literary dunce cap, marked out forever as someone who is not in the know. And I find the authors of articles like 10 books that are dating red flags irritating for a sort of relatively similar reason. Although we probably aren't as similar, they still have the effect of weaponizing books as a way of evaluating or condescending to people. They are, in effect, saying that if you have read some books, you are less romantically appealing. And you might say that this is kind of a trivial concern, and to a certain extent, of course, it is. But we're already in a situation where men aren't reading very much, and certainly not reading very much fiction or literature. So, what's the goal of treating books in this way? Ultimately, I think it's the same superiority-chasing trick that the reader pulls, but just in a different direction. Whereas the reader attempts to judge you as a whole person based on what you haven't read, the authors of this article attempt to do pretty much the same thing, but based on what you have read. And in both cases, and this will become a consistent theme in this video, the actual books themselves fall by the wayside. The aim is not to share a mutual love of something, but to signal a certain kind of intellectualism, to place yourself above others and condescend to them from your pillar of intellectual virtue. And this prioritization of identity over activity is really limiting. It makes it seem like reading is some kind of elite thing rather than literally one of the most accessible joys out there. I've spoken before about our tendency to create a sort of sharp divide between inner essence and outer behavior, as if who we are is totally separate from what we do, and I think that this is just a particular manifestation of that. When we place an awful lot of weight over whether someone is a reader, it basically feels like we're creating a chimera-esque reader in the machine that we're fruitlessly inquiring after. In short, both of these groups of people are snobs. They're so obviously snobs that it probably feels weird that I haven't been using the word snob so far in the video. But this got me thinking, what actually is a snob? Why does it annoy us so much? And what does this have to do with identity? 2. The origin and varieties of snobs. In her Philosophy Compass article on the philosophy of snobbery, Stephanie Partridge discusses the history of the term. Apparently, it's quite a recent descriptor. It first took on a pejorative connotation in the 1830s when it became a word to just generally denote someone lower or working class who has poor taste. It was a little bit like the 2000s British slang term chav. Later, it takes on a slightly more specific meaning as a lower class person who attempts to imitate those of the upper classes in aesthetics and taste in a kind of social climby way. Partridge points out that we still sometimes use snob in this usage today, but it's now more commonly just used to denote someone who genuinely does have high-class tastes, whatever that means, and uses that as a reason to look down on other people. As Partridge puts it, an attitudinal snob makes holistic judgments about overall rank and worth of persons on the basis of criteria that, at best, support localized judgments. Partridge splits the varieties of snobs into 4 camps. First, there is the aforementioned attitudinal snobs, who, in her words, see themselves as separated from the herd because of their ability to appreciate this or that. Then there are the social contagion snobs, whose explicit goal is to impress other people with their supreme aesthetic taste. There is a more limited kind of contextual snobbery, where someone introduces an aesthetic standard that is deemed contextually inappropriate, like if someone demanded that you play Mozart at a kid's birthday party. And then there's just straightforward classism, where someone demeans something largely because it's considered working class or otherwise associated with a lack of money or social status. As far as I can tell, and Partridge herself hints at this point, the lines between these categories are really quite blurry. Is there really that big of a difference between someone who likes something because of social status and someone who sees themselves as more socially prestigious because they like something? Sure, these are logically distinct, but I bet they often come together in the same person. Likewise, the gap between liking things purely because of their social prestige and looking down on people who are less socially prestigious than you seem like natural bedfellows. What all of these ideas about snobbery have in common, and indeed they share this with things outside of snobbery as well, is that they're not about the thing under discussion, be it a piece of artwork or a book, or in this case, the concept of reading. They're instead primarily focused on the attributes of the people taking part in the discussion. And we can now explain that fixation on character judgments that we talked about in the last section. The through line in all of these definitions of snobbery, at least in my opinion, is that attention is primarily paid to the identity of liking something or hating something, rather than the natural activity of just happening to like and dislike certain things. That's a little bit abstract, but to take it back to the original tweet that sparked this video, the tweeter in question wasn't commenting on authors like Machiavelli, Melville, and Tolstoy. They were instead commenting on the kinds of people who read or have read Machiavelli, Melville, or Tolstoy. There is an illegitimate inference going on here from the activity of reading or reading particular authors, which is pretty limited in scope, and the totality of someone's identity. I sometimes see this attitude labeled as performative. To read for the sake of being a reader is considered performative reading. But I'm not a massive fan of this label, if I'm honest. If anything, I think it seems to have things slightly backwards. It implies that the person is dishonest about their like and dislike of authors, which I don't think necessarily needs to be the case. And moreover, provided that they are reading the books, which I think they often are, it's clearly not just a performance. There's also just an extent to which everything we do, at least everything in the public eye, is going to be performative because we can't help but react to the fact that other people will be watching us and making judgments about us. So Rather than focusing on the performance of reading, I would rather look at how this relates to the identity of being a reader. So I would instead call it something like identificatory reading, and that's the label that I'll use for the rest of the video. There are two main problems I have with identificatory reading, that is, placing too much emphasis on the identity of the reader when we're talking about reading. The first is that rather than widening the number of people reading, it thrives off fewer and fewer people reading. And the second is that it traps the identificatory reader into an epistemic blind alley. I'll tackle each of these in turn. Firstly, the prestige of identificatory reading rests on the idea that the number of people engaging in the specific kind of reading being identified with, whether that's reading as a whole or reading some specific books, is a small and elite group. It wouldn't make any sense bragging about reading an author that everyone else has also read. Thus, there is an incentive in identificatory reading to make the number of people who are deemed readers a smaller and smaller group. This is both what we would expect to see if reading was used primarily as a marker of prestige in some circles, and what I think we actually do see in practice. I also think this kind of attitude discourages others from reading. Normally, the process of narrowing the circle of readers is not as explicit as this. Oftentimes, people won't say something as cringe-sounding as "you're not a real reader." They'll instead vaguely gesture at someone being stupid or dumb. The implicit assumption here is a kind of essentialism about reading. Under this framework, you are either the type of person who reads or not the type of person who reads, in a way that doesn't seem linked explicitly to someone's reading habits. For instance, you're either the kind of person who reads Tolstoy or you're not, and if you're not, then there's no point reading Tolstoy because you'll only misunderstand it. I think this type of prestige-seeking is also behind the particularly vitriolic way you will often see people treat others who disagree with them about certain books, or who just happen to like different books. It's a way of keeping the group of elect true readers small enough that it remains a club worth being a part of. This is most clear with particular groups often based around classics, but I think it's just as evident in those who are talking about things like red flag books, because they too are trying to take a set of books and, for prestige or social reasons, trying to exile them from the set of acceptable reading material. You'll often see really quite comical purity spirals among groups of this kind of reader, whereby the bar for entry becomes reading Tolstoy and then reading this specific, often lesser-known book by Tolstoy, and then having this particular interpretation of this lesser-known work by Tolstoy, and so on and so forth. In each case, the elect become smaller and smaller as they must distinguish themselves even further from those who have also read a fair amount. Thus, I think this attitude is likely to put people off reading and generally make them think that certain books are just not for them in a permanent and irrevocable way. This is a tragedy, and I want to avoid it at almost any cost. I love these books, and I would love it if more people were to read and share in that love. Secondly, and I know this sounds kind of obvious, but if you're reading primarily for identity concerns about your own character or intelligence, you're devoting a large part of your attention in reading to yourself rather than the books. This is part of a wider observation made in the philosophy of both Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch. An overly developed sense of self-concern can get in the way of fully paying attention to the thing in front of you. It often acts as a kind of lens that locks you into a particular, often distortive, way of seeing the world. This is clearest in more general cases of extreme self-consciousness. For example, I remember being in one of my first supervisions at my old university, and I was so nervous about how I came across to my supervisor, who was a highly accomplished academic that I respected an awful lot, that I struggled to put any kind of coherent argument together in front of him. This was, in effect, my own worries about my own self-concept and identity getting in the way of what, on reflection, I really ought to have been paying attention to, which were the arguments and writings under discussion. To use another example, I remember when I was quite a bit younger, I often found myself so nervous on a date that I ended up coming across as like a total arse, because I literally couldn't pay attention to what my date was saying because I was so worried about what she would think of me. These are quite trivial examples, but they do help illustrate Weil and Murdoch's point, that excessive self-concern can get in the way of where we actually want to place our attention and focus. And to bring this back to identificatory reading, There is thus an epistemic issue with focusing too much on what your reading says about you. And that is that you'll become so focused on coming up with the right or clever opinion to have on a particular work of literature that you might forget, A, to, actually enjoy it, and also B, have your own unforced thoughts about it. And thus, I think it impoverishes the act of reading itself. Take the Dostoevsky novella Notes from Underground that I've talked about on the channel countless times. If you wanted to be really clever at a dinner party, you could talk about how much of the contents of the book, especially the first third, are responding satirically to another book by Chernyshevsky called What Must Be Done, which advocated for a kind of rational egoism in human psychology and politics. I guarantee you that unless the person has looked into it independently or done some academic reading around the topic, very few people, even those who otherwise have read Dostoevsky's work, will know about that in depth. There's also nothing inherently wrong with making this observation. I made it in my own video on Notes from Underground. However, if we're approaching books with the primary aim of making ourselves look clever or to distinguish ourselves intellectually from those around us, then we'll be so focused on finding these clever-sounding tidbits and interpretations that we might end up missing out on all the parts of the book that appeal idiosyncratically to us for reasons that might not be particularly clever or make for good showing-off material, but are undeniably edifying and engaging and, perhaps most importantly, personal. In other words, it can take us away from an honest, first-person reading of the text towards a more impressive-sounding but very impersonal one. There's nothing wrong with an impersonal reading of a text. I just think that we might be missing out here if that is our sole aim. Somewhat related to this, there's the additional danger of never discovering our own literary tastes. I have incredibly basic tastes in literature, so I will normally enjoy what most lovers of the classics will recommend. But others might not share my tastes, and if we are overly aggressive about our own preferences, then it might genuinely discourage someone from refining their own unique literary palette in the direction that would bring them the most enjoyment and edification. Ultimately, the epistemic vice of literary snobs is arrogance. Epistemic arrogance is essentially when someone is far more sure than they're justified in being about a given proposition or proclamation. For example, it would be really epistemically arrogant of me to proclaim that some highly specific interpretation of Nietzsche is the true interpretation that reflected what he genuinely meant, because I know full well that almost everything in Nietzsche, beyond some basic points, is pretty heavily disputed in the academic literature around him. Epistemic arrogance is undesirable for a couple of reasons. The first is that it impoverishes our own epistemic position. I'm much less likely to spot mistakes in my own thinking if I am overconfident about my own correctness. But the second is that it's a kind of social cheating. Epistemic arrogance is socially performed to mimic epistemic authority when it isn't necessarily there. It's the confidence trick of literary snobs of all varieties. Even if you personally are a die-hard aesthetic realist, which is already a minority position in philosophy, the greatest thinkers in history have been debating about the meaning of beauty for thousands of years with multiple competing theories. To posit one's own literary or aesthetic tastes, especially if they're rather narrow, as the absolute objective best ones in such a strong way is, in my view, an epistemically unjustified social maneuver that will probably just fool someone who doesn't know very much about the subject. In my view, then, identificatory reading is both cheating ourselves and cheating those around us. It cheats those around us by presenting false authority, and it cheats us by closing our minds to further literary development. But the thing is, I don't think this kind of thing is limited to reading at all. I think it represents a far wider trend in human behavior that I would personally like to see fall by the wayside. 3. The Capture of Values. Recently, I read a fantastic book called The Score by C.T. Nguyen, which, among many other things, explored the concept of a value capture. This is where something that we value is sort of taken over by a metric that is meant to just measure that thing, but ends up replacing it wholesale. A good example that comes from the book is something like a linear university ranking system. Different students ultimately want quite different things out of particular universities, and flattening this into a unidimensional hierarchy is not always the best way to choose where you want to go to university. For instance, there might be a university that isn't that great overall, but has a particular specialism in an area that you might personally want to study, like dentistry or neuroscience or something like that. However, once the metric is in place, it can be incredibly seductive. Whereas you initially wanted to find the best institution for your speciality and the place that's going to allow you to follow your curiosity to the greatest extent, the prestige that's associated with going to the number one ranked university in your country or the number two or number three or what have you might sway you from this path. You can thus end up with a less helpful education for your particular interests because of this value capturing process. Le Guin talks about value capture when it comes specifically to metrics and scoring systems and the like. But when I was reflecting on this topic, it struck me that the phenomenon is much, much broader than this. As far as I can tell, the primary elements of value capture are just that, one, there is some proxy property that is used to measure the property we actually care about, and two, due to the fact that the proxy property is more visible and easier to communicate than the property we actually care about, we gradually optimize our behavior for the proxy property rather than the property itself. In other words, the measurement replaces the thing it was meant to measure due to its immediate accessibility and communicability. Metrics are one example of an accessible but flattening proxy measure, but others might include particular aesthetics, ways of presenting yourselves, or indeed identities. Let's start with a non-literary example. Two of my childhood friends are really into heavy metal. In fact, they share many of the same favorite songs and favorite bands. I wouldn't be able to say that one knows more about heavy metal than the other, but their outward presentation is very, very different, and how you'd identify them is very, very different. One of them dresses like a stereotypical metalhead. He wears leather jackets, distressed jeans, he has really long hair, and the beginnings of what I imagine will be a truly magnificent beard, as well as many, many piercings. It's the kind of thing that I would look really silly in, but it absolutely suits him. The other friend actually favors dressing a little bit more formally, and often wears some variation on smart trousers and a shirt. That's actually what I'm wearing now, but this isn't me talking in third person. The point is, they both have great knowledge and enjoyment of metal. But for one, it is obvious, and for the other, it is less so. So far, of course, there's nothing misleading here, but it does illustrate an obvious truth. The aesthetic and the outward presentation of the identity is more publicly accessible than the interest. This presents the further possibility that someone could adopt or follow aesthetics that would lead everyone to think that they were a heavy metal enthusiast, even when they might not have the same interest in the genre. I don't know why someone would do this, but it is a possibility. And to bring this back to reading, there are various presentation-based markers that identify someone, rightly or wrongly, as, I don't know, for want of a better term, a kind of serious literary person, although that term makes me cringe. These obviously exist in the realm of fashion and stuff like that, but since this video is about how we talk about books, let's focus on the kind of markers that appear in dialogue. They will often involve a disdain for any writing, philosophical or literary, that does not belong to an acknowledged great thinker or great writer. There'll sometimes be an assumed air of intellectual and aesthetic authority, as we talked about in the last section, and there will be the further assumption that most people are less intellectually accomplished than this serious literary person. There'll often be a presentation of somber, brooding thoughtfulness. And all of these, and we've talked about many of them in more detail already, are more publicly accessible than the books a person actually has or hasn't read, or is not reading. They're also far easier to imitate than just spending a lot of time reading. Thus, the incentives are aligned not really to encourage reading, as we said before, they're to just kind of imitate the dialogue markers of being a reader. I think that it's this presentation that more accurately tracks the reading identity than anything else. Of course, there is a temptation here to leap to what I think would be a simplistic conclusion, that the group of identificatory readers are just phonies trying to cash in on the appearance of intellectualism without having read very much at all. But I don't even think that's the main effect of this value capture by aesthetics. For a start, I think many of these people are quite well read, and I don't see any reason necessarily to disbelieve them about that. And I also think that a far more insidious effect of this is what we touched upon in the last section, but didn't draw out the full consequences of, which is where someone is discouraged from reading the kind of material that they would personally find intellectually stimulating and forcing themselves to follow a list of classics instead. Because a list of must-read classics that are the bare minimum for conversation is simpler and easier than learning to explore and indulge our own creative outlook, especially if you're just getting started and don't necessarily know where to start. Now, I'm not saying that there's no reason why classic books are recognized as classics. I mostly do read classics, and I find that I almost always really enjoy them. And if you've been around the channel for long enough, then you'll know that I'm pretty passionate about trying to encourage more people to approach these books. However, I don't think that the best way to get people into reading these books is to tell them that they're a kind of incurable ignoramus if they haven't read War and Peace cover to cover. One of the most interesting findings from recent educational research is that people tend to enjoy reading more as their reading skill increases. So if someone does want to develop their own reading, then they're more likely to enjoy it, and I would argue more likely to stick at it, if they choose to read books that they can still read pretty much fluently, yet also push them just a little bit out of their comfort zone. But this more moderating personal approach doesn't track the aesthetic of reading that's become our value-capturing proxy metric. This is what I mean when I say that the focus on the aesthetic and the identity of reading will discourage people from actually reading these books for themselves. It's not just that the general snobbery makes reading sound and seem rather intimidating, it's also that when it becomes the received way to approach reading, it sets many of us off on a path that might not suit us or where we happen to be. It doesn't help that when it comes to reading, unlike a lot of other hobbies, there already seems to be this general sense that it's obtuse, especially when it comes to classic books, or that it's something that you require hand-holding through, rather than something that you are perfectly capable of exploring. Since the aesthetic of the reader specifically trades on reading's inaccessibility, this can become a self-reinforcing cycle, and I think that it supports this ultimately really quite destructive idea that people are too stupid to read the classics, which I think is just ridiculous. Alternatively, there are deleterious metrics that I also see being used in reading discourse online that don't particularly relate to snobbery. One example is people focusing on the number of books that they've read or the number of pages that they read per day. Having particular reading goals in terms of pages or books is something that I unavoidably use in my work because ultimately, I have deadlines that I want to meet, and that involves planning out a lot of stuff in advance. But I'm highly skeptical of how these metrics are used more broadly. Depending on the book, it could take either 20 seconds or 10 minutes to read a single page. Far more than this if we're talking about things like maths textbooks. And, as we'll come onto in the next section, this metricized approach promotes an attitude whereby reading is something that we want to get done or to be over and done with, rather than a process and an art and a skill that we're trying to enjoy and improve in. But my overall point is that this kind of general value capture can happen with all kinds of activities, not just with reading, and not just with more obviously recognizable metrics. For instance, we might set out to simply satisfy our own curiosity on our learning journey, to use a slightly cringe term, but because looking clever is a visible proxy metric for satisfying curiosity, we end up pursuing that instead to our own detriment. Or this might happen within particular fields. Say that you personally are really interested in the most difficult to untangle kinds of continental philosophy. But because some pretty intelligent but perhaps premature analytic philosopher says that it's nonsense, you decide to not push that any further. In each case, we're using various proxy metrics to try and figure out what we want our learning to look like, and potentially not leaving enough room for our own peculiar and particular interests. Now, you might understandably wonder why I am so focused on people pursuing what is uniquely interesting to them. And of course, there is the more surface level point that they will enjoy it, and provided we're not talking about work or something like that, I think that enjoyment ought to be pretty close to the forefront of our attention when we're talking about reading. But I also have a different and slightly more selfish motive. If we're all pursuing the same kinds of reading and learning metrics, we're reading from the same list of books, having the same clever-seeming thoughts when reading them because we've kind of optimized for that, and we're all presenting our ideas in the same way, and then learning the same things as a result, I think we'll also end up thinking in roughly the same way. And I think this would be a complete disaster to the sheer diversity of ideas and thought processes out there. And moreover, I think it can take away from what is so very interesting about coming together and sharing our love on a given book or author or subject. For example, I have a friend of mine who is really into Russian literature, and we share many of the same favorite authors, but we have vastly different takes on them. I read Dostoevsky as a cautious but ultimately unshakable optimist, and he reads him as an outright pessimist. I remember when we both read A Hero of Our Time by Lermontov, and we both had totally different takeaways from the novel. Our discussions would have been a lot less fun, and I think a lot less edifying for both of us, if we'd felt this relentless pressure to think in the same way about the authors involved. It is in the differences that we both learn new things from one another and learn to see these texts and ultimately the world in new ways. But this only works precisely because we are allowing and encouraging differences to flourish there without trying to fit it into a prefigured mold of what we both consider that we're supposed to think. By the way, this is also something that I've really enjoyed about running the reading groups on Substack. It's been lovely hearing all of your thoughts because so often they are so very different to my own. But on a different note, I actually want to end the video by zooming out even further and saying something that I imagine will be a little bit controversial. 4. The worship of knowledge. This might sound like a weird thing for someone who runs a philosophy-focused channel to say, but I've become increasingly convinced that knowledge, in the way that we often use the term, is a little bit overrated. This isn't because I think that knowing things is bad, but because I think that venerating the state of already knowing something is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think that it prevents us from embracing one of the historically most important philosophical virtues, which is recognizing and indeed turning our attention to the shores of our own ignorance and unashamedly admitting to and reveling in. To illustrate this, I want to explore a story by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, which I first came across in Lowry Presley's book The Right to Oblivion, and has since become one of my favorite short stories. It follows a young man, Ireneo Funes, who was thrown from his horse and became paralyzed. But in the process, he gained this quasi-magical ability to remember everything he has ever seen or read or felt or thought in perfect detail. As the narrator of the tale puts it, we, at one glance, can perceive 3 glasses on a table. Funes, all the leaves and tendrils and fruit that make up a grapevine. He knew by heart the forms of the southern clouds at dawn on the 30th of April 1882, and could compare them in his memory with the mottled streaks on a book in Spanish binding he had only seen once. Funes himself seems ambivalent about this power. He compares himself favourably to some of the people around him, saying that they are asleep and he is awake, but he also refers to his limitless memory as a garbage dump. When a lot of people read the story, they're struck by both the extraordinary nature of Funes's gift and also its strangely sterile feel. There is a sense, and I don't think it's an unjustified one, that Funes's life is a little bit flat, and that this flatness is directly related to his gifts. To again quote the narrator of the story, I suspect, however, that he was not very capable of thought. To think is to forget differences, generalize, make abstractions. In the teeming world of Funes, there were only details, almost immediate in their presence. When Presley looks at the story, he focuses on the element of forgetting, how Funes's world is deprived of dark corners and felt depth. However, I want to focus instead on how it illustrates the sterility of already knowing something. When I was younger, and I was imagining, as I think isn't unusual for a young child, what wishes I would make to a sufficiently genial genie, for a long time one of them was, I wish that I knew everything. There's still a part of me that really desires this state, the state of already knowing all things. But as I've got older, and this has only been reinforced by reading this story, I've kind of soured on this idea. What I really enjoy, upon reflection, is not already knowing things, it's learning things. It's feeling like I am understanding the world a little bit better than I did this time the previous day. And as in so many things, the end result is largely an excuse to go through what I actually take joy from, which is the process. What I really desire when push comes to shove is a continual, never-ending process of discovery. The state of knowing everything and focusing on what's already known and having already achieved bits of knowledge is actually antithetical to what I want to get out of what I read or what I experience. And when I think about so much of our current attitude to reading and our reading discourse, I'm struck by how little of it is about the activity of reading at all. It's instead about having already read things. We ask one another, have you read this or have you read that? And yes, part of why I find this irritating is because I suspect that it's being used as an identity marker, as we've already discussed. But I also think that there's something deeper here. This whole attitude of focusing on what you've already read is turning our attention to the least exciting part of reading. Surely the most thrilling aspect of the endeavor is the reading itself, and having read something is almost a byproduct of this. To hone in specifically on the classics, one of the most famous definitions of a classic book comes from Italo Calvino, and it's this: the classics are the books of which we usually hear people say, I am rereading, and never, I am reading. This at least happens among those who consider themselves very well read. It doesn't hold good for young people at the age when they first encounter the world and the classics as a part of that world. Obviously, this is a slightly tongue-in-cheek definition, but it does really relate to Calvino's overall observation about classic books, which is that we can return to them over and over again and seemingly discover new nooks and crannies and sometimes whole side streets of richness and meaning that we hadn't come across before. Take Albert Camus' novel The Plague, which is a personal favourite of mine. I've read it 3 times, and each time there was something new that was highlighted. It was brought to the forefront, even if I wasn't noticing it for the first time. The first time I read it, I really focused on the false sense of security that was held by the people of Oran, and how quickly they returned to their willful blindness when, spoiler alert, the plague was over. The second time, it was the journey of Raymond Rambert and his gradually evolving sense of humanistic solidarity. The third time, the thing that really leapt out at me was the theme of friendship, and specifically the friendship that emerged between Dr. Ryu and Taru. The issue that I have with focusing on what we've already read, especially and kind of mostly when it comes to these specific books that are considered classics, is that these are the books, more than any other, that I think that we're never really done with. If I read The Plague a 4th time, I have no doubt that I would find yet more things that weren't highlighted the other 3 times that I read it. I mean, hell, people spend their entire lives doing the equivalent of deep-sea diving with works like the Iliad and the Aeneid, and they still get to their deathbed convinced that there is more to find. So great is the richness of these works, and none of this is captured when we focus on what we've already read and what we already know. So let's revisit that tweet from the beginning of the video, because in many ways I really do think that it illustrates everything that I don't like about the ways in which we discuss reading today. First of all, it is using books as a proxy measure for the whole of someone's character and being, in my view, unreasonably snobbish in the process. Secondly, it attempts to divide a sharp line between readers and non-readers and use that as a kind of hard identity marker. Thirdly, it loses sight of reading itself, becoming value captured by a certain aesthetic. And fourthly, and maybe most importantly, it treats these authors like a checklist of people to be done with, rather than what I think reading at its best can be, which is an inexhaustible process of learning, discovery, understanding, and enjoyment, where we don't think of books as items we have finished, but as something like resting until we have the chance to pick them up again, or until someone else picks them up and helps us realize what we might have missed. This is ultimately why I don't like the way we talk about reading now. And I hope that over the course of this video, I've at least given some indication for a slightly more positive route forwards. This has been a slightly different video to some of the other ones I've done. My thoughts haven't been as organized, but yeah, I kind of just wanted to blurt this out there into the void. But if you are searching for somewhere to get started with the classics, then I do have a list of more accessible ones right here. Though, I hasten to add, please do not get value captured by my list. It is just a flavor palette of some works that I've enjoyed and think that others will enjoy as well. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.